This seat isn't for people like you, 7 words that would cost this flight crew everything. But the man in the hoodie they just humiliated had no idea he was about to witness the most expensive assumption of their careers. When Dr. Malcolm Harris was kicked out of first class based purely on his appearance, the discriminatory crew had no clue they'd just targeted the CEO of the company that monitors airline bias. Watch as a respected flight attendant risks his career to deliver a message that changes everything. Passengers secretly record the shocking discrimination, and the moment when the captain himself walks down the aisle to apologize to the man they called unworthy sends shockwaves through the entire cabin. But what happens next, at 30,000 feet, will redefine aviation forever, because Dr. Harris doesn't just fire the crew mid-flight. He launches a technological revolution that transforms how millions of passengers will be treated in the skies. This isn't just about one man's fight for dignity. It's about the moment when accountability met altitude and proved that sometimes the most powerful people are the ones you least expect to have power. Stay until the end to see how 7 words of discrimination became the catalyst for the biggest change in aviation history. This seat isn't for people like you. Those 7 words would cost this flight crew everything they thought they knew about power. But the man in the hoodie settling into seat 1A had no idea he was about to witness the most expensive assumption of their careers. What happened next at 30,000 feet will shock you, but first, let me tell you about Dr. Malcolm Harris and why this ordinary Tuesday flight was about to become aviation legend. JFK Airport's Terminal 4 buzzed with the controlled chaos of international departures, where business travelers rushed past families saying tearful goodbyes, and where the scent of expensive coffee, mixed with jet fuel, created the unique atmosphere of global ambition. Gate 47 was preparing for departure to London, and among the stream of passengers boarding Flight 815, one figure stood out precisely because he didn't stand out at all. Dr. Malcolm Harris moved through the boarding line like any other tired traveler, his faded Howard University hoodie and worn jeans suggesting someone who had grabbed the first comfortable clothes he could find. His Nike sneakers had seen better days. His backpack looked like it had survived multiple cross-country trips, and his only visible accessory was a pair of reading glasses that hung from a simple cord around his neck. To the casual observer, he appeared to be someone who had lucked into an upgrade or perhaps saved for months to afford premium seating. What the boarding crew couldn't know was that this unassuming figure had revolutionized aerospace technology for an entire generation. Dr. Harris was the founder and CEO of Skyguard International, a company that had transformed aviation safety through cutting-edge compliance systems and bias detection technology. His firm's innovations were now standard equipment on aircraft worldwide, and his personal net worth exceeded that of most small countries' GDP. The irony was that Skyguard had just signed a massive contract with this very airline to investigate and eliminate discriminatory practices in their customer service operations. For weeks, Dr. Harris had been receiving disturbing reports about this specific flight crew complaints that seemed to follow a pattern of treatment that correlated suspiciously with passengers' race and appearance. His executive assistant had compiled a file of incidents so troubling that Dr. Harris had decided to experience the service firsthand. Today's flight was pure reconnaissance. He'd instructed his assistant to book the ticket under the name Michael Henderson, a common alias he used for corporate travel when he needed anonymity. His team had no idea he was conducting this inspection. This was the kind of real-world testing that no consultant could replicate and no focus group could reveal. As he settled into seat 1A, Dr. Harris felt the familiar weight of being underestimated, a sensation that had fueled his rise from a working-class neighborhood in Detroit to the pinnacle of aerospace innovation. He'd built his empire by understanding that the most dangerous assumptions were the ones people made about capability, based on appearance, and something told him this flight would provide a masterclass in exactly that kind of prejudice. Opening his tablet to review technical specifications for his company's latest bias detection algorithms, Dr. Harris had no idea that he was about to become the subject of the very discrimination his technology was designed to prevent. The flight crew approaching his seat was about to provide him with more research data than any laboratory could generate. What happened next would prove that sometimes the most powerful people are the ones you least expect to have power. If you believe that respect should be standard at every altitude, hit that like button and let me know in the comments what you think Dr. Harris will discover about his own airline partners. This story is about to take off in ways that will redefine what accountability looks like at 30,000 feet, and trust me, you won't want to miss what happens when assumptions meet reality in the sky. Subscribe because stories about dignity in travel affect every single one of us. Right at that moment, as Dr. Harris settled into his premium seat and opened his tablet, the discrimination he'd come to investigate was about to reveal itself with shocking clarity. What happened next would prove that prejudice doesn't wait for takeoff. It begins the moment assumptions take control of professional judgment. Carla Morrison, a 20-year veteran flight attendant whose blonde hair was pulled into a regulation bun and whose smile had been perfected through decades of customer service training, approached seat 1A with the confident stride of someone accustomed to managing first-class passengers. But as her eyes took in Dr. Harris's casual attire, something cold flickered across her professionally pleasant expression. "Excuse me, sir," Carla said, her voice carrying the saccharine tone reserved for delivering bad news with forced politeness. "I'm going to need to see your boarding pass again. There seems to be some confusion about your seat assignment." Dr. Harris looked up from his tablet, recognizing the familiar pattern he'd studied in discrimination reports for years. "Of course," he replied calmly, retrieving his boarding pass from his backpack. "Seat 1A, first class to London." Carla examined the boarding pass with exaggerated scrutiny, holding it up to the light as if checking for counterfeit currency. Her voice grew louder, clearly intended for other passengers to hear. "Sir, I think you may be in the wrong seat. This is our premium cabin, and I'm not sure this assignment is correct." The subtle emphasis on premium cabin sent ripples through the first-class section. A middle-aged white businessman in the seat across the aisle chuckled softly and shook his head, while an elderly woman peered over her magazine with obvious curiosity. Dr. Harris felt the weight of their stares, the familiar sensation of being treated like an exhibit rather than a human being. The boarding pass clearly shows seat 1A. "Doctor," Harris said, his voice maintaining the calm professionalism that had served him in countless boardroom negotiations, "is there a specific problem with my documentation?" That's when flight attendant Jennifer Walsh joined the conversation, her expression showing the kind of theatrical concern that poorly trained staff often mistake for helpfulness. "Sir, sometimes there are computer errors with upgrades. I think what Carla is trying to say is that this seat may have been mistakenly assigned to you." The word mistakenly landed like a slap across the cabin. Several passengers were now openly watching the interaction, some reaching for their phones with the instinct of people who sensed they were witnessing something significant. Dr. Harris noticed a young black woman in seat 2C quietly activating her phone's camera, her face showing the recognition of someone who had experienced similar treatment. "I purchased this ticket specifically for first-class service, Doctor," Harris replied, his tone remaining steady despite the growing hostility. "My boarding pass is valid, and I'd like to remain in my assigned seat." Carla's mask of professionalism began to slip, revealing the impatience underneath. "Sir, we're trying to be accommodating here, but if you continue to be difficult about this, we'll have no choice but to call security. We have protocols for passengers who refuse to cooperate with crew instructions." The threat hung in the air like turbulence, transforming what should have been a routine boarding process into a confrontation that would soon make aviation history. Dr. Harris realized he was witnessing exactly the kind of systematic discrimination that his technology was designed to detect and prevent. What none of them knew was that every word, every assumption, every discriminatory action was about to become evidence in a case that would transform not just this flight, but the entire industry's approach to passenger dignity. But the tragedy had not stopped yet. What happened next would prove that Carla and Jennifer's discrimination wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a coordinated effort to humiliate a passenger they judged unworthy. And Dr. Harris was about to experience the full force of institutional prejudice at 30,000 feet. The situation escalated when Mark Stevens, the lead flight attendant, emerged from the galley with the authoritative stride of someone accustomed to resolving conflicts through intimidation rather than service. His crisp uniform and stern expression suggested he'd been called in to handle what the crew clearly viewed as a problem passenger rather than a paying customer deserving respect. "Sir, I'm going to need you to gather your belongings and move to your correct seat assignment," Mark declared, his voice carrying the finality of someone who expected immediate compliance. "We've been more than patient with this situation, but we have a schedule to maintain." Dr. Harris looked up at the 3 flight attendants now surrounding his seat like a tribunal delivering judgment. "I'd like to speak with your supervisor about this matter. My seat assignment is clearly correct, and I'm not sure why this has become such an issue." "I am the supervisor on this aircraft," Mark replied curtly, his tone suggesting that questioning his authority was both futile and inappropriate. "And I'm telling you that if you don't move voluntarily, we'll call security to escort you off this plane. We have zero tolerance for passengers who refuse to follow crew instructions." The first-class cabin had become eerily quiet, with every passenger now openly watching the confrontation unfold. The young black woman in 2C continued recording discreetly, while a Latino businessman in seat 3A shook his head in obvious disgust at what he was witnessing. Several white passengers appeared uncomfortable but remained silent, their discomfort not translating into action. Jennifer stepped closer, her voice taking on the patronizing tone often used with children or individuals deemed intellectually inferior. "Sir, we're trying to help you avoid embarrassment here. The economy cabin has perfectly comfortable seating, and you'll be much happier there with passengers who are more appropriate for your situation." The word appropriate sliced through the cabin like a blade, its implications crystal clear to everyone present. Dr. Harris felt the familiar sting of discrimination that he'd experienced throughout his rise in the tech industry, but this time he had the power to do something about it. They just didn't know it yet. "I understand your position," Dr. Harris said quietly, beginning to gather his belongings with the dignity of someone who refused to be broken by prejudice. "I'll move to avoid further disruption, but I want you to know that this treatment is being documented." Mark's expression showed the smug satisfaction of someone who believed he'd won a power struggle. "That's your right, sir, but you'll find that airline policies support crew decisions regarding passenger placement and safety." As Dr. Harris walked down the aisle toward economy class, he passed rows of passengers whose expressions ranged from sympathy to embarrassment to outright shame. The businesswoman who had been recording whispered, "I'm so sorry," as he passed, while others avoided eye contact entirely. But what Mark, Carla, and Jennifer didn't realize was that their victory was about to become the most expensive mistake of their careers. Dr. Harris wasn't just documenting their behavior, he was gathering evidence that would soon transform their confident discrimination into career-ending consequences. The man they just humiliated was about to show them exactly what happened when assumptions met accountability at cruising altitude. No one expected what Dr. Harris would do next. But what unfolded in the economy cabin would prove that sometimes the most powerful response to discrimination isn't immediate retaliation. It's strategic documentation that transforms individual prejudice into systemic accountability. Dr. Harris settled into seat 24C with the calm composure of someone who had learned to channel humiliation into fuel for change. The economy section buzzed with the uncomfortable energy of passengers who had witnessed the first-class confrontation, many stealing glances at the man who had been so publicly degraded. But instead of anger or embarrassment, Dr. Harris displayed something far more dangerous to the crew's comfortable prejudice: clinical observation. Opening a discreet voice recording app on his phone, Dr. Harris began documenting everything with the methodical precision of a scientist gathering data for a research study. He noted the timestamps, the specific language used by each crew member, and the reactions of passengers who had witnessed the discrimination. His years of developing bias detection technology had taught him that patterns of prejudice were most effectively exposed through comprehensive documentation rather than emotional confrontation. From his new vantage point, Dr. Harris observed the crew's behavior with passengers throughout the cabin, and what he saw confirmed his worst suspicions about systematic discrimination. The same flight attendants who had humiliated him now moved through the aircraft with telling consistency in their treatment of different passengers. When a well-dressed white businessman in first class requested an extra pillow, Carla responded with enthusiastic service, personally bringing him a selection of comfort items and asking if there was anything else she could provide. Her smile was genuine, her tone warm and accommodating, a stark contrast to the cold hostility she had displayed just minutes earlier. But when an elderly black woman in economy asked for assistance reaching her carry-on bag, Jennifer responded with visible irritation, suggesting the passenger should have packed more carefully and reluctantly providing minimal help. The difference in treatment was so pronounced that several passengers exchanged uncomfortable glances, recognizing the bias even if they didn't speak up about it. The most damaging evidence came when Dr. Harris overheard a conversation between Carla and Mark near the galley, their voices carrying clearly through the cabin as passengers settled in for departure. Mark was speaking loudly enough for several rows to hear, apparently unconcerned about who might be listening. "I don't care who they think they are or what kind of complaint they want to file," Mark said with the casual arrogance of someone who believed himself untouchable. "They don't belong up here unless they look the part. We have standards to maintain, and those standards aren't just about ticket prices, they're about the kind of people we serve." Carla laughed, her voice carrying the same dismissive tone she'd used during the confrontation. "Exactly. These people think they can just buy their way into first class, and suddenly they deserve the same treatment as our real customers. But breeding shows, and you can't fake class no matter how much money you throw around." The words were devastating in their clarity, revealing not just individual bias but an institutional culture that had normalized discrimination as a form of quality control. Dr. Harris felt his jaw tighten as he realized that what he'd experienced wasn't an aberration, it was standard operating procedure for this crew. Even more troubling was how other staff members responded to this conversation. Rather than challenging the discriminatory attitudes, they nodded in agreement or remained silent, their complicity enabling the continuation of systematic prejudice. Dr. Harris watched as junior flight attendants absorbed these lessons, learning that discrimination was not only acceptable but encouraged by senior staff. The evidence continued to mount as Dr. Harris observed the crew's interactions with other passengers of color throughout the cabin. A young Latino man requesting assistance with the overhead compartment was told curtly to "figure it out yourself," while a white passenger making the same request received immediate help. An Asian businesswoman asking about meal options was given minimal information, while white passengers received detailed descriptions of available choices. Each incident was carefully documented in Dr. Harris's notes, creating a comprehensive record of bias that extended far beyond his own experience. His background in data analysis and pattern recognition allowed him to see the systematic nature of the discrimination. This wasn't about individual prejudice, but about an organizational culture that had institutionalized bias as normal behavior. But the most revealing moment came when Dr. Harris overheard Jennifer speaking to another passenger about the earlier incident. "Some people just don't understand that first class is about more than money," she said with the confidence of someone stating an obvious truth. "It's about maintaining a certain atmosphere, a certain clientele. When you let just anyone up there, it changes the whole experience for our premium customers." The casual cruelty of reducing human dignity to atmosphere and clientele crystallized everything wrong with the crew's mindset. Dr. Harris realized he wasn't just witnessing discrimination, he was documenting a case study in how prejudice becomes policy when left unchecked. As the aircraft prepared for takeoff, Dr. Harris reviewed his notes with the satisfaction of someone who had gathered comprehensive evidence of systematic bias. The crew members who had humiliated him had no idea that their comfortable prejudice was about to collide with consequences they never saw coming. What they were about to discover was that sometimes the most powerful people are the ones who appear most powerless, and that accountability has a way of finding altitude at exactly the right moment. If you believe that dignity should be standard on every flight, hit that like button and let me know in the comments what you think Dr. Harris should do with this evidence. This story is about to reach cruising altitude where justice meets accountability. And trust me, you won't want to miss what happens when the crew discovers who they've really been dealing with. Subscribe because stories about respect in travel affect every single one of us who's ever felt judged by our appearance. Right at that moment, as Flight 815 reached cruising altitude, Dr. Harris decided it was time to transform documentation into action. What happened next would prove that sometimes the most powerful revelations occur when people least expect them, and the crew was about to discover that their comfortable prejudice had just collided with consequences at 30,000 feet. Dr. Harris had spent the first hour of the flight quietly observing and documenting, but now he was ready to deploy the strategic move that would change everything. He noticed David Thompson, a young flight attendant who had remained conspicuously absent from the earlier discrimination, moving through the economy cabin with genuine courtesy toward all passengers regardless of their appearance or background. "Excuse me," Dr. Harris said quietly as David approached his row during beverage service. "Could you do me a favor and deliver this envelope to the captain? It's regarding a matter of significant importance to flight safety and operational security." David looked at the sealed envelope with curiosity but professional concern. The words flight safety and operational security were triggers that any aviation professional took seriously, and Dr. Harris had chosen them deliberately. "Of course, sir. Is everything all right?" "Everything will be fine," Dr. Harris replied, with a calm smile that carried hints of the authority he was about to reveal. "Just ask Captain Rodriguez to review the contents when he has a moment. Tell him it's from Dr. Malcolm Harris of Skyguard International." David's eyes widened slightly at the mention of Skyguard International, a name that every aviation professional recognized as the industry leader in compliance technology and safety systems. But he maintained his professionalism and headed toward the cockpit with the envelope, unaware that he was about to trigger the most dramatic power shift in commercial aviation history. Within minutes, the captain's voice came over the intercom with an announcement that sent ripples of curiosity through the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Rodriguez. We have a very distinguished passenger aboard today, and I'd like to personally ensure that all our guests are receiving the exceptional service they deserve." The words carried an undertone that made several passengers look around with interest, but the crew members who had participated in Dr. Harris's humiliation seemed oblivious to any connection between the announcement and their earlier behavior. Mark continued his rounds with the same arrogant confidence, while Carla and Jennifer maintained their differential treatment of passengers based on appearance and perceived status. Then everything changed. Captain Rodriguez himself appeared in the economy cabin, his uniform immaculate and his expression serious, as he made his way directly towards seat 24C. The sight of the captain leaving the cockpit during flight was unusual enough to capture every passenger's attention, but what happened next would be talked about for years to come. "Dr. Harris," Captain Rodriguez said, his voice carrying the respectful tone reserved for aviation royalty, "I want to personally apologize for any inconvenience you may have experienced during boarding. As the chairman of Skyguard International, you deserve far better treatment than what I understand you received." The words hit the cabin like turbulence, causing a ripple of shocked whispers and turned heads. Passengers began reaching for their phones, sensing they were witnessing something extraordinary. But the most dramatic reactions came from the crew members who had orchestrated Dr. Harris's humiliation. Mark's face went white as he realized the implications of what he was hearing. Carla dropped the coffee pot she was holding, the crash echoing through the cabin as the reality sank in. Jennifer stood frozen in the aisle, her mouth open in disbelief as she stared at the man she had dismissed as unworthy of first-class service. "Skyguard International?" a passenger whispered to her companion. "Isn't that the company that monitors airline safety and compliance?" "Not just monitors," another passenger replied, loud enough for the crew to hear. "They're the ones who determine whether airlines meet federal standards for bias prevention and customer treatment." Dr. Harris stood up with the dignity of someone reclaiming his rightful authority, his casual clothes, no longer a sign of low status but a reminder that power doesn't always announce itself with expensive suits. "Captain Rodriguez, thank you for your courtesy. I've been conducting an inspection of customer service protocols as part of our compliance partnership with this airline." The captain's expression grew more serious as he understood the implications. "Dr. Harris, I hope our crew has met the standards we discussed in our corporate agreements." "I'm afraid they haven't," Dr. Harris replied, his voice carrying across the now silent cabin. "In fact, I've documented behavior that directly violates not only your company's stated policies, but also federal guidelines for equal treatment in aviation." Mark stepped forward, his earlier confidence replaced by desperate damage control. "Dr. Harris, if there's been any misunderstanding—" "There's been no misunderstanding, Doctor," Harris interrupted, his voice steady but firm. "There's been systematic discrimination, and I have comprehensive documentation of every incident." The cabin erupted in whispers as passengers realized they had witnessed not just discrimination, but the exposure of that discrimination by one of the most powerful figures in aviation. Phones appeared throughout the aircraft as people began recording what they sensed would become viral footage. Captain Rodriguez looked at his crew with the expression of someone who understood that careers were about to end. "Dr. Harris, what would you like me to do?" Dr. Harris looked around the cabin at the passengers who had witnessed his humiliation and the crew members who had orchestrated it. The moment had arrived for accountability to meet altitude, and justice was about to be served at cruising speed. "Captain," he said with the calm authority of someone who had just reclaimed control of the situation, "I think it's time for some immediate personnel adjustments." But the real shock was yet to come. What Dr. Harris did next would prove that true accountability doesn't wait for landing. Sometimes justice needs to be served at 30,000 feet, and the crew was about to discover that discrimination has consequences that can't be delayed until reaching the gate. Dr. Harris stood in the center of the economy aisle with the calm authority of someone who had just reclaimed complete control of the situation. The entire cabin had fallen silent except for the steady hum of the engines. Every passenger and crew member focused on what would become the most dramatic moment in commercial aviation history. "Could I have the attention of the entire flight crew, please?" Dr. Harris said, his voice carrying clearly through the aircraft's intercom system that Captain Rodriguez had quietly activated. "I'd like to address some immediate operational concerns that require your attention." Mark, Carla, and Jennifer gathered reluctantly in the center aisle, their faces showing varying degrees of panic, denial, and desperate hope that somehow this situation could be salvaged. Other crew members who had witnessed but not participated in the discrimination watched with nervous anticipation, understanding that they were about to witness corporate justice in real time. Over the past 2 hours, Dr. Harris began, his voice maintaining the measured tone of someone delivering a clinical assessment. "I have documented systematic discriminatory behavior that violates not only this airline's stated policies, but also federal regulations governing equal treatment in commercial aviation." He pulled out his phone, displaying the comprehensive notes he had taken throughout the flight. "Mark Stevens, you threatened to have me removed from the aircraft for requesting to remain in my assigned seat. You stated that passengers must look the part to deserve first-class service. Carla Morrison, you loudly suggested that I was in the wrong seat based solely on my appearance. And you made disparaging comments about passengers who, don't have breeding. Jennifer Walsh, you characterized my legitimate request for equal treatment as being difficult and suggested that I would be more appropriate in economy class. Each accusation landed like a hammer blow, and several passengers began recording as they realized they were witnessing something unprecedented. The young businesswoman who had discreetly filmed the original incident now held her phone openly, capturing every moment of this historic accountability. But most damaging, Dr. Harris continued, his voice growing stronger, is the systematic nature of your discrimination throughout this flight. I observed differential treatment of passengers based solely on race and appearance, creating an environment where dignity is determined by skin color rather than humanity. Captain Rodriguez stepped forward, his expression showing the gravity of someone who understood that his airline's reputation hung in the balance. Dr. Harris, as captain of this aircraft and representative of our airline, I want to state clearly that the behavior you've described is completely unacceptable and contrary to everything we claim to stand for. Dr. Harris nodded acknowledgement to the captain before turning back to the 3 crew members whose careers were about to end at cruising altitude. Your behavior today has validated every complaint that led to Skyguard International's investigation of this airline. You have demonstrated exactly the kind of institutional bias that our technology and policies are designed to eliminate. Mark stepped forward desperately, his voice cracking under pressure. Dr. Harris, if we've made mistakes, we can correct them. We can apologize. We can do better. You can do better, Dr. Harris interrupted, his voice carrying the finality of a judge delivering a verdict. But you won't be doing it as employees of this airline. Effective immediately, all 3 of you are relieved of duty pending formal termination. You will be met by security personnel upon landing, and your conduct will be reported to aviation authorities for potential inclusion in industry-wide databases. The announcement hit the cabin like an explosion. Passengers erupted in a mixture of gasps, applause, and shocked whispers. Several people were openly recording, understanding that they were witnessing a historic moment of corporate accountability that would be shared millions of times across social media. Carla began crying, her earlier arrogance replaced by the devastating realization that her prejudice had cost her a 20-year career. Please, Dr. Harris, I have a family, I have bills, I can't lose my job over this? You didn't lose your job over this, Dr. Harris replied, his voice gentle but unwavering. You lost your job because of this. Because you chose to treat passengers differently based on their appearance. Because you created an environment where discrimination was not only acceptable but encouraged. Jennifer tried a different approach, her voice taking on the desperate tone of someone grasping for any possible salvation. Dr. Harris, we were just following policies, doing what we thought was best for the airline. No, Dr. Harris said firmly. You were following prejudice, not policies. There is no airline policy that authorizes discrimination based on race or appearance. What you were following were your own biases, and now you're facing the consequences of those choices. Captain Rodriguez addressed the cabin over the intercom, his voice carrying the authority of someone taking immediate action. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to personally apologize for the unacceptable behavior you have witnessed. Effective immediately, we are implementing new protocols to ensure that every passenger receives the respect and dignity they deserve. Dr. Harris looked around the cabin one final time, taking in the faces of passengers who had witnessed both discrimination and accountability in action. This isn't about revenge, he said to the entire aircraft. This is about ensuring that no passenger ever again experiences what I experienced today. Dignity isn't a luxury, it's a right. What happened next would prove that sometimes the most powerful transformation occurs when consequences meet altitude, and justice refuses to wait for a more convenient time. No one expected what Dr. Harris would do next, but what unfolded in the remaining hours of the flight would prove that true leadership isn't about punishment alone, it's about transformation. and he was about to demonstrate how to turn a moment of discrimination into a movement that would revolutionize aviation forever. With the 3 discriminatory crew members now confined to crew quarters under Captain Rodriguez's supervision, Dr. Harris stood before a cabin full of passengers who had witnessed the most dramatic corporate accountability moment in aviation history. But instead of savoring his victory, he was preparing to launch something that would extend far beyond this single flight. "Ladies and gentlemen," Dr. Harris announced, his voice carrying the authority of someone who is about to change an entire industry. "What you witnessed today wasn't an isolated incident. It was a symptom of systematic problems that exist throughout commercial aviation. But today, we're going to do something about it." He pulled out his tablet and connected it to the aircraft's entertainment system, displaying a presentation that would captivate every passenger on the plane. "I want to introduce you to BiasTrack, a revolutionary system that Skyguard International has been developing to eliminate discrimination in aviation." The screen showed sleek interface designs and data visualizations that looked like something from a science fiction movie. BiasTrack uses artificial intelligence to monitor passenger interactions in real time, analyzing voice patterns, response times, and service quality to identify potential bias before it escalates into discrimination. Passengers leaned forward in their seats, fascinated by the technology that was being unveiled at 30,000 feet. The young businesswoman who had recorded the earlier incident raised her hand. "Dr. Harris, how does the system actually work?" "Excellent question, Doctor," Harris replied, clearly energized by the opportunity to explain his innovation. BiasTrack monitors multiple data points show long crew members take to respond to different passengers, the tone and language used in interactions, the quality of service provided relative to ticket class, and stated policies. When patterns of bias emerge, the system alerts supervisors and creates automatic documentation for review. Captain Rodriguez stepped forward, his expression showing genuine enthusiasm for the solution. "Dr. Harris, this technology could transform how we ensure equal treatment across our entire fleet. When can we begin implementation?" "Actually," Dr. Harris said with a slight smile, "we're beginning implementation right now. This flight has been serving as a live test environment for BiasTrack's capabilities. Every interaction you witnessed today was being monitored and analyzed by our system." The revelation sent another wave of excitement through the cabin. Passengers began to understand that they hadn't just witnessed discrimination and accountability. They had been part of a technological revolution that would protect future travelers from similar experiences. Dr. Harris continued his presentation, explaining additional features that would reshape aviation customer service. BiasTrack also includes anonymous reporting capabilities, allowing passengers to document concerning behavior without fear of retaliation. Every report is analyzed for patterns, and crew members with multiple substantiated complaints receive immediate retraining. But the most innovative feature was yet to be revealed. Perhaps most importantly, we're implementing public transparency dashboards. Every airline using BiasTrack will display real-time data about customer satisfaction, bias incident reports, and crew performance metrics. Passengers will be able to make informed decisions about which airlines truly prioritize equal treatment. The implications were staggering. Airlines would no longer be able to hide discrimination behind corporate policies and private investigations. Customer treatment would become as transparent as flight schedules and ticket prices. This system will be mandatory across all major carriers within 18 months, Dr. Harris announced, causing passengers to erupt in spontaneous applause. Federal aviation authorities have already approved BiasTrack as a required component of airline compliance programs. David Thompson, the flight attendant who had courageously delivered Dr. Harris's message to the captain, raised his hand. "Dr. Harris, what about training for crew members who want to do better but might not recognize their own unconscious biases?" "Outstanding question, Doctor," Harris replied, clearly impressed by David's thoughtfulness. BiasTrack includes comprehensive cultural sensitivity training modules, real-time coaching alerts, and mentorship programs, pairing experienced diversity advocates with crew members who show commitment to improvement. He gestured toward David with obvious respect. In fact, crew members like David who demonstrate integrity and courage in challenging situations will be invited to join our BiasTrack Ambassador program, helping to implement these changes across the industry. The announcement transformed David from a junior flight attendant into a pioneer of aviation equity, his decision to deliver Dr. Harris's message having launched his career in an entirely new direction. But Dr. Harris saved the most powerful announcement for last. Every passenger on this flight will receive complimentary access to BiasTrack's reporting system for life. You've witnessed both the problem and the solution, and we want you to be part of ensuring that what happened today never happens again. The cabin erupted in cheers and applause as passengers realized they had become part of something historic, not just witnesses to discrimination, but partners in creating a more equitable future for all travelers. Captain Rodriguez made a final announcement that would be remembered long after landing. Ladies and gentlemen, this flight will be designated as BiasTrack Flight 1, the inaugural journey of a new era in aviation equality. What began as a routine flight to London had become the launchpad for a revolution that would transform how millions of passengers would be treated in the skies above. But the most powerful moment was yet to come. What Dr. Harris would do after landing would prove that true transformation extends far beyond a single flight, and his final message would resonate through boardrooms, training centers, and airport terminals around the world for years to come. 3 days after Flight 815 touched down at Heathrow Airport, Dr. Harris stood in the sleek conference room of Skyguard International's headquarters, preparing to deliver a video message that would fundamentally change how the aviation industry approached customer dignity. Behind him, floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of aircraft taking off and landing, a perfect backdrop for announcing the future of air travel. The video began with footage from the flight, not of the discrimination itself, but of the passengers who had witnessed it, their faces showing the range of emotions from shock to anger to hope as they watched accountability unfold in real time. Dr. Harris had chosen to focus not on the problem, but on the solution and the people who would help implement it. 3 days ago, I experienced discrimination that thousands of passengers face every day. Dr. Harris began, his voice carrying the calm authority that had made him a leader in aerospace technology. But what happened next proved something more important, that change is possible when we refuse to accept injustice as inevitable. The video cut to scenes of BiasTrack being installed across airport terminals, showing technicians implementing the monitoring systems that would protect future travelers. We're not just talking about equality, we're engineering it. BiasTrack is now active across 200 airports in 37 countries, monitoring over 50,000 passenger interactions daily. But the most compelling footage showed the human impact of the transformation. The young businesswoman who had recorded the original incident was now serving as a passenger advocate, using her experience to help other travelers navigate discrimination complaints. David Thompson had become BiasTrack's Director of Crew Relations, traveling between airports to train staff on bias recognition and prevention. Change doesn't happen in boardrooms or policy meetings, Dr. Harris continued, his voice growing more passionate. It happens when ordinary people refuse to stay silent in the face of injustice. Every passenger who documents discrimination, every crew member who speaks up for what's right, every witness who chooses courage over comfort, they are the real architects of transformation. The video showed statistics that would have been unimaginable just months earlier. Bias incidents in aviation had dropped by 73% across airlines using BiasTrack. Customer satisfaction scores for passengers of color had increased by 89%. Most remarkably, crew members using the system reported feeling more confident and effective in their roles, understanding that technology was supporting rather than monitoring them. "We learned something important on Flight 815, Dr. Harris said, his voice taking on the tone of someone sharing a profound revelation. Dignity isn't a luxury that some passengers earn and others don't. It's the foundation of service itself. When we treat every passenger with respect, we don't lower our standards raise them." The camera pulled back to show Dr. Harris standing before a wall displaying thank you messages from passengers around the world, travelers who had experienced the difference that BiasTrack was making in their journeys. Letters from families who no longer feared discrimination when flying. From business travelers who could focus on their work instead of worrying about how they would be treated. From elderly passengers who felt welcomed rather than dismissed. But the most powerful segment showed what had happened to Mark, Carla, and Jennifer, the 3 crew members whose careers had ended on Flight 815. Rather than simply disappearing from the industry, they had become participants in mandatory community restitution programs that Dr. Harris had helped design. Mark was shown working at a community center, helping travelers from low-income neighborhoods navigate airport procedures and understand their rights. His arrogance had been replaced by genuine humility as he listened to stories from people who had experienced the kind of discrimination he had once perpetuated. Carla was teaching bias awareness workshops at flight attendant training schools, using her own experience as a cautionary tale about how unconscious prejudice can destroy careers and harm innocent people. Her tears were no longer about losing her job, but about understanding the real impact of her actions on fellow human beings. Jennifer had become an advocate for passenger rights legislation, working with government agencies to strengthen protections against discrimination in transportation. Her desperation to save her career had transformed into dedication to ensuring that no other crew member would make her mistakes. "Some people ask if I was too harsh in firing them mid-flight," Dr. Harris said, addressing the controversy that had followed the incident. "But I believe that accountability and redemption aren't opposites, they're partners. True consequences create opportunities for genuine change." The video concluded with Dr. Harris returning to Seat 1A on a Skyguard International corporate jet, but this time the scene was different. He was dressed in the same casual clothes that had triggered the original discrimination, but the crew greeting him showed nothing but professional respect and genuine warmth. "This is what progress looks like," Dr. Harris said as the camera captured flight attendants treating every passenger with equal dignity regardless of their appearance. Not perfection but improvement. Not overnight transformation but sustained commitment to doing better. The final shot showed Dr. Harris looking out the aircraft window as cities passed below, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had turned personal discrimination into global change. "We're not just flying people from one destination to another. We're elevating humanity itself. Because when we treat every passenger with dignity, we don't just change flights, we change the world." The video ended with text that would become the motto for aviation equity worldwide: "Skyguard International, where dignity takes flight." Within hours of its release, the video had been viewed millions of times, shared by airlines implementing BiasTrack, and featured in news programs across the globe. But more importantly, it had been seen by passengers who now understood that discrimination in aviation wasn't something they had to accept, it was something they could help eliminate. Dr. Harris had proven that sometimes the most powerful response to injustice isn't anger or revenge, it's the systematic commitment to ensuring that no one else experiences what you experienced. Flight 815 had become more than a journey from New York to London. It had become the flight path to a more equitable future for every person who would ever board an aircraft. The sky was no longer the limit, it was the beginning of unlimited possibilities for dignity, respect, and equality at every altitude. What Dr. Harris accomplished at 30,000 feet wasn't just about one flight or one moment of discrimination, it was about something far more transformative. As someone who's witnessed countless instances of bias in corporate settings, I can tell you that what you just saw represents the difference between complaining about problems and engineering solutions. Most people who experience discrimination might file a complaint or share their story on social media, But Dr. Harris did something revolutionary. He turned his personal humiliation into systematic change that protects millions of travelers. The profound lesson here isn't that we should all become undercover CEOs to catch discrimination. It's that dignity should never depend on recognition, title, or appearance. Every Mark, Carla, and Jennifer in this story represents a system that judges worth by clothing rather than character. And every David Thompson represents the choice we all have to either enable injustice or stand up against it, even when it's uncomfortable. What moves me most about this story is how Dr. Harris proved that true power isn't about revenge, it's about transformation. He could have simply destroyed those crew members' careers and walked away, but instead he chose the harder path of creating lasting change, giving them opportunities for redemption while ensuring no other passenger would face what he faced. That's the kind of leadership that doesn't just change policies, it changes hearts and entire industries. The reality is that discrimination in travel isn't rare, it's systematic. Passengers are judged by their skin color, their accent, their clothing, and their perceived status every single day at airports around the world. But stories like this prove that change is possible when we refuse to accept that some people deserve less dignity than others, and when technology meets moral courage to create accountability. Dr. Harris didn't just engineer BiasTrack, engineered hope. Hope that the next time you board a plane, you'll be judged by your humanity rather than your appearance. Hope that dignity truly can take flight at every altitude. If this story inspired you to believe that respect should be standard in every industry, not just aviation, smash that like button and let me know in the comments what systematic change you'd like to see next. Subscribe to this channel because we're building a community of people who understand that true progress happens when we turn moments of injustice into movements for dignity. Hit that notification bell because these stories of transformation and accountability are exactly what our world needs right now. And trust me, the next story of systematic change will be even more powerful than this one.